Okay. I don't think that's at all
What was that?
intended. Well, you know Brunswick Mine, Harvey. You know the Brunswick Mine?
Yeah,
You know
yeah.
Wood says it's in passive care. Okay, that presentation is now on the server, Harvey, and under Icold 2021. I'm now going to break out of this and come in on the WebEx for the
Okay,
thing.
I got her.
Okay, good luck.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, where is our host? It's 10 o'clock in Delhi.
Yep. So I was just talking to Andy about the this SME handbook that seems to be coming to a conclusion. Sounds good. And it was a pity that we couldn't get ours out before them, but I guess if they get theirs out first, we can look at theirs and change ours to suit, I guess.
Well, I mean, there's not much changing in ours, so I think we just have to press on.
Yeah, that's right. So there you are, Andy.
Yeah, I'm there now. We'll see how it works.
Sounds pretty good. What happened before, do you think?
On occasion, as rural internet kind of cycles down, like it's for no reason I'm aware of, it just sort of slows down, then it speeds up again.
Probably thinks you're all asleep at that time.
Yeah, they probably think they can do an upgrade or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Harvey, the Brunswick mine is to be considered a passive care closure.
Yeah, is that right, eh? Oh, well, I guess we don't have to audit it anymore.
Yeah. No, it's just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, people always we always get people who try and do something. But we have someone on the line.
Yep. They're mute.
Sure who. We are ready for the presentations to start, or the workshop to start, whenever you are.
Yeah.
Andy's getting all his homework done.
Yeah. Great opportunity to catch up.
Yeah. Got a nice glass of red there, Harvey? Very good.
Yeah, I have to have my glass of pomegranate juice to get me through the night.
Yeah. Well, I'm sitting in a pretty interesting place here. It's like a It's a it's a podcast studio on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland.
Oh, really?
It's a very hot day outside, sunny and about 30, 32 degrees and humid.
Yeah.
So it's nice and cool in here, though.
Yeah, I was going to say you haven't done much decorating in that room.
No, it's just it's designed for making podcasts and videos and stuff. It's quite good, really.
Yeah. Okay. It's
so David and I were chatting the other night or other morning night, and at one point I wasn't watching the video, and then at one point it says, "Hey, check out my picture now." And this adorable little girl showed up in there.
Yeah, well, I didn't. I thought it'd be good to go somewhere else, so that didn't happen again.
That was funny. She got her head stuck right in there. Hello.
Yeah.
And then a phone call came in from David's 100-year-old father.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, which was pretty neat.
100 years old.
Yep. Well, 100 and a half.
Oh, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, he's pretty amazing. He's pretty. His mind's pretty good. His body's not that good, but he's still pretty switched on.
I'd prefer it that way.
Yeah, well, that's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, well, both of mine are shot, so I don't know if I'll make it to 100.
Yeah, I don't think I will.
Morning, Mr. Harvey.
Here we go.
Yes, are you ready to go?
Yes, ready to go. And on behalf of organizer, Indian Committee on Large Dam, we welcome all the speakers for this session.
Mm-hmm.
And now I request you to take the floor and start.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Get a few things out of the way. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow Icold members and people who are attending this workshop. So this is a workshop put on by the Icold Tailings Subcommittee, and it's to outline or to give some indications as to what is going on with our new bulletin called Tailings Dam Safety. And first of all, we do have the key authors and people speaking tonight and the subjects that they're giving. Myself, I'll give an overview of our guideline. My background, first of all, my name is Harvey McLeod. My background is a geological geotechnical engineer with over 45 years experience on hundreds of dams around the world. I led the investigation with the Ministry of Mines on the Mount Polley investigation, and trusted advisor for many mining companies, and I think I've looked at over 200 tailing dam safety reviews in the last 5 years. Secondly, giving a talk on tailings governance, engineer of record, is Andy Small, and he is a geotechnical engineer, and he's been working in dam safety, dam design for over 30 years. And really, he's been instrumental with the Canadian Dam Association in developing guidelines. Been an active member there for 20 years and has garnered some awards with that. And he was the lead author of the Canadian Dam Association Mining Dam Bulletin that was issued in 2014. And he's developed several additional guidance documents. So he'll be talking today on the engineer of record. Annika Belkvik is from Sweden. She'll be talking today on closure of tailing dams and the importance of starting with the closure plan at the beginning. And she has a Master's of Science degree and a licensed technical degree on tailing dam long-term stability. She has her own company. She's a senior geotechnical tailings engineer specializing in design, construction, etc. And she's worked in many countries, Sweden, South Africa, and others. And with their company called Tailings Consultant Scandinavia, It's evolved into many tailing projects in Sweden, Norway, and Finland. And Annika has been the Swedish representative in Icold's Tailing Dam Committee since about 2000, so she's been a very active member of the committee. And David Brett, who'll be giving several presentations tonight. His first one is Understanding Dam Failure Consequence Categories, What, Why, and How. And David is a civil geotechnical engineer with over 40 years experience in water management and mine waste storage facilities with a wide range of metal and coal mining operations, both in Australia and Southeast Asia. And he's done work on abandoned mines and environmental performance during operation and closure of mine waste structures. Oops, that went too fast. He's an active member of Icold, convener of committees responsible for producing Icold guidelines for tailing dams, and Australia's representative on Icold Tailings Dam Committee. So welcome, David. And Jiří Hirza, he'll be speaking. He's a representative from Czechoslovakia. He's a civil engineer with 15 years international experience in dams, tailings, hydropower, mine waste, and geotechnical, and covering the whole gamut from field to site investigations and design of civil structures. He's a project and design manager for water supply and hydropower and tailings and mine waste projects, from concept to construction. And he's worked in Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, South Africa. He's also an independent reviewer and auditor of mining projects. Now, I missed one talk. David will be giving two talks actually tonight. One is on the Understanding Dam Failure Consequences, and his second talk it will be on the water management aspects. And then I'll close the session just giving a talk on training initiatives for tailing dams, design, operations, and management. There's a lot going on in the industry with respect to tailings and training, and it'd be good to relate some of those to today. So that kind of gives you the framework for our workshop today. So we hope you enjoy the workshop, and we'll jump into our presentations now. So the first one, Tailings Dam Safety, Introduction to Icold's New Bulletin, presented by Harvey McLeod. Now, the Tailings Dam Subcommittee, we've been working on this bulletin for a number of years, probably 3 or 4 now. And we have a core working group of dedicated people. We've got Annika Malkovic from Sweden, Raphael Monroe from the United Kingdom, Paul Ridland from the United States, Duncan Grant Stewart from South Africa, David Brett from Australia, Jiří Hirza from the Czech Republic, Joaquim Pimenta de Vela from Brazil. And we also have a co-opted member. This is from the International Council of Mining and Metals, ICMM it's referred to, Imran Jalani. So this core team has been working on this bulletin very diligently and producing a very comprehensive bulletin. And we recognized a number of years ago, there's really a need for common international guidance. And Icold certainly takes the lead in developing tailings dam design guidance and best practices. But there was a need we saw for pulling all of the components of good design and good governance of tailing dams into one document. And this is in general alignment with, there is a global industrial standard for tailings management, initials GISTM, not sure how you say that, but issued in 2020. And I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment. But also aligning with the International Council of Mining and Metals. So we're looking at getting, moving towards having common guidance for tailing facilities international. And certainly the focus of our group, focus of Icold, dam safety technical guidance that provides requirements for design of tailing dams, inclusive of design basis, geotechnical, hydrotechnical, environment, risk management, and closure for safe dams. that's kind of the framework for what we are putting into our bulletin. Now, I mentioned the Global Industrial Standard for Tailings Management. It was issued last August. It's a document prepared by the International Council of Mining and Metals in conjunction with Principles for Responsible Investing, PRI, and the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. And together they have something like, I think, an astounding, I don't know, I guess $10 trillion of investments in the mining industry. So they have a very vested interest in understanding and having safe dams. And they developed a protocol that covers 6 topics, covering 15 principles and 76 requirements. And this is being adopted by all members of ICMM, which comprises 27 of the most major mining and metal companies in the world. And the chapters, the key topics: affected communities, integrated knowledge base, understanding all the information that you need to design, build, operate a tailings facility. The design, construction, operation, and monitoring aspects, and this starts to link more with Icold. Management and governance, emergency response and long-term recovery, and lastly, public disclosure and access to information. So they have produced a protocol and with these lists of requirements, and those will be implemented over the next 1, 2, or 3 years with these mining companies. And in conjunction with that, ICMM is producing a document called Tailings Management, a Good Practice Guide. And it is a guideline that aligns with the global standard. And there's 3 key parts to that: sort of a general overview of mining, et cetera, governance of tailing dams, and implementation of good engineering practices for tailings management. And, you know, this is quite complementary to what Icold is doing. The focus of the ICMM bulletin is more on governance and practices and implementing good procedures, which are extremely important part of it. And the Icold Tailings Dam Safety Bulletin is aligned with that. And our goal is we're looking at the technical aspects of tailing dams. So we dig deeper into the technical aspects, and ICMM digs deeper into the governance aspects. So just to give you a flavor for what our bulletin does contain, and I'm not going to describe every detail of our bulletin, otherwise I'd probably be here for 4 hours. But the main chapters, as we go through: tailings storage, facility governance, closure aspects, dam classification, site characterization of dams, tailings design, risk management, dam failure analysis, dam breach analysis, emergency preparedness and response, construction and operations. So it's covering all the key elements that include both good design, but also elements of governance that are important for dam safety. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the general chapters and just relay some of the key elements. And so on the left here, you'll just see a partial table of contents for the bulletin. This is covering the governance, enclosure, and dam classification. And under the governance, certainly one of the things that, and it really hit home from the Mount Poly incident in Canada, the dam failure, where when you looked at who was responsible for the design, they had something like 5 different engineers of record in 5 years. So it's very difficult to say, well, who is responsible for the design? And so understanding the key roles and responsibilities, like who is what we now call the engineer of record, taking primary responsibility for dam safety aspects, who is the responsible person at the mine who is responsible on a day-to-day basis for looking after the project. And on a corporate level, who is ultimately responsible for the safety of the dam. And understanding those key roles and responsibilities is very important to both so people understand what the responsibilities are, but equally important, if there are elements of what they're responsible for that they're not sure about, they can get training and get support in those areas. Chapter 3 is closure, and Annika will be talking about that later today. It's so, tailing dams, we use we're mining for sometimes 10 years, sometimes 100 years. And after that, we close the facility. And we want to be assured that it's closed in a safe manner. And certainly Icold's bulletin on sustainable tailing dam design is a good reference. So her talk will cover the importance of closure. And David will talk later on the dam classification. Basically having a common system that's being used by everybody for classifying a dam, so that you're aware that, if the dam, the consequence of failure is something that if you hear it mentioned in one country, it can be the same as in another country. So it's getting a common classification system for consequence of failures. The next two chapters, and these kind of cover site characterization and the tailings characterization. One of the recommendations from the panel from the Mount Poly failure was that there should be guidance on site characterization. And the Association of Engineers in British Columbia put together a guideline on site characterization that covers all the essential elements for dam safety. And I think the guideline is called Site Characterization of Dam Foundations. And it applies both to water dams as well as it does to tailing dams. Whether you're building a water dam or a tailings dam, your foundation is your foundation, and you have to understand the conditions. The tailings characterization, and this was a big focus of our bulletin 181, Tailing Technology Update, where we went through and developed a system for classifying tailings into 5 categories and for having typical properties of different types of tailings. Because as you know, tailings are not all the same. They can vary from very brittle, sensitive slime tailings, like at Brumadinho and those failures, or you can go to hard rock tailings. So there's many different types of tailings, and we have categorized them into 5 different categories. Part of my jumping around here. And so understanding the properties of your tailings is a key element in a safe tailings dam design. I guess the most meaty part of the whole bulletin is on design. I mean, the design is critical. A good design, you have very few problems during the life of a mine with a good design. So starting with a very good design is really an important element of tailing dam safety. So we cover the different life phases from site selection, technology selection, through to design, construction, and all the way to closure, and finally sort of final closure, safe closure as we use the term. And a key element in all of the design is risk informed. You want to understand how the dam could fail and be designing your dam to prevent that. And if you think about it, the main dam failure modes, dams fail on foundations like Mount Poly and Asnacolar in Spain. They can fail by overtopping like Bayamar and other projects. They can fail with broken decants, releasing materials. They can fail by in the dam itself, which was the liquefaction failures in Brazil. And there's natural hazards. You can have landslides and in northern climates, snow avalanches and river erosion. And we also consider environment, because you can have a very safe geotechnical design, but if a facility is, leaching acidic drainage and harming the environment, that is actually a failure mode. So understanding those modes and putting in your design that looks at how those could happen. And then we go into stability analysis, and Jerry Hirza will be giving a talk later this afternoon on stability analysis. And tailings, basically they, particularly with upstream dams, where they form the structural portion of your dam. Tailings are deposited loose, they're saturated, and they behave undrained. So the practice of using drain factors of safety is not correct or practical for tailings facilities. And we'll get into deformation-based analysis. You can look at deformation using that for designing your dam as opposed to factors of safety, or in conjunction with it. And certainly seepage and hydrotechnical environmental design. So the next sections cover risk management and dam failure analysis. So this is looking at what can go wrong if the dam starts to fail. What are your trigger action response plans for how you may respond to things? And also when we look at how tailing dams fail, they're remarkably different than water dams. Water dams, if the dam fails, all the water goes out. With tailing dams, they don't. Some may have more go out, and some may have very little tailings go out. So there's really two mechanisms. You've got the water transported tailings. So, if you have a cubic meter of water, it could wash away a cubic meter of tailings. And secondly, then is what I call the geotechnical mechanism. If there's potential for liquefaction or unconsolidated tailings near the upper part of the tailings facilities, those can flow. And then lastly, emergency preparedness and response planning in the event that something does happen. So the other key elements that we cover, and these are the last few, are the construction aspects, having good QA/QC, and probably the biggest or a significant issue there is having good as constructed records of your dam, and not just geometry, but knowing what are the geotechnical conditions all the way through your dam. And so when you start a tailings dam, you need to document the condition of the foundation when you had it, and when you're raising the dam, all the geotechnical aspects as in conjunction with the QA/QC data and the geometry. And the operations, operation maintenance and surveillance manual. There's important tool or manual that's used for operations to get the critical aspects of your operations, whether it's operating your freeboard allowances, your pumping systems, your water recovery systems, seepage collection. All those are important. And then lastly is your monitoring and surveillance. And certainly with monitoring and surveillance, there's been huge strides made in the industry with respect to the technology of monitoring and surveilling, and being able to monitor things from satellites and drones and in situ instruments. But we still always have to go back to, what are we monitoring, and what are we trying to make sure we know what's happening so the dam does not fail. So in summary, the Dam Safety Bulletin, it's comprehensive components of dam safety and governance. It's aligned with the global standard and ICMM guidance. And it's to be submitted to Icold Central Office for approval in Marseille and Icold later this year, COVID willing. So we hope that goes well. And so that concludes my talk. So thank you very much. So our next speaker today is David Brett. And David is going to cover the dam classification. So David, I'll stop sharing my screen and maybe turn it over to you, or were we going to have some questions at this stage? No, we weren't. So we'll go on. So David, I'll pass it over to you and I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Harvey. I'll get mine organised then. Share screen.
Oh, actually, did I have you right, or was it Andy?
I think it might have been Andy, but do you want to go back to Andy?
Hey, Andy, do you want to do yours because you are up late?
That's right.
My apologies, everyone. It's late at night in Canada, so we may not be as sharp as we're supposed to be. So Andy Small, he's in Eastern Canada, so it's even later for him. So we're going to have Andy go next with the governance presentation on engineer of record. There you go, Andy. Thanks. Are you on, Andy? I'm just.
Andy's on mute.
Are you on mute, Andy? Yeah, you're on mute, Andy. Okay.
There we go. Okay, we'll try this again here.
Okay.
We've lost you, Andy. You have no sound.
So Harvey.
Yeah.
Maybe you could run the presentation from the server.
Okay, let me just.
So for those of you that are listening, sorry, the internet I'm working from is a bit spotty, and so I have pre-recorded the presentation, and Harvey's going to play it on his improved internet.
Yeah, okay. Let's see if technology works, Andy. So I just press slideshow and start.
Yeah, share your screen.
Yeah.
And then just press slideshow.
I don't know if there's sound, Andy.
Okay.
No, I don't.
Okay, so I'll take the sharing back. My apologies, I'll take the sharing back and I'll just run it through.
Okay.
And hopefully it'll work.
Okay.
Yeah, so as I was saying, there's several items in this presentation dealing with key elements of tailings storage facility governance, but truly what we're focusing on is engineer of record with description and so on, qualifications, and how an EOR should be engaged. How's the audio now, David?
It's good, Andy.
It's good.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So in terms of key responsibilities, key elements of the tailings storage facility governance, there's accountabilities, responsibility, competencies, planning and resourcing, having a risk management program, a change management program, and a plan for emergency preparedness and response, and review and assurance. Key positions related to the safety of tailings dams include the owners group, which has a board of directors, accountable executive officer, responsible site person. Then there's the engineer of record, which is typically a consultant, and independent technical reviewers, which support the owner. This approach has been considered a solid approach for governance of tailings dams. Within the Canadian Dam Association, as part of the governance guidance we've provided for engineer of record, we've developed a RACI matrix. RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Support, Consent, and Informed. And that template is available for you. It has 55 best practices for tailings management and dam safety management. And it allows you an opportunity to go through and identify the roles and responsibilities of the different positions. And in so doing, you can develop a staffing plan that's customized for every owner and every project. This whole approach up here was developed first by the Mining Association of Canada and is embraced by the GISTM. I am not activating the slide view on purpose because of the audio recording interfering with what I'm doing now. So the dam owner is ultimately responsible for the safety of the dam. They need to understand the risks created by the dam. They develop policies, plans, and procedures necessary for complying with the requirements of the applicable dam safety statutes, regulations, and practice. Now, obviously, the dam owner has to provide the necessary resources to sustain the design and so on. This graphic shows the key positions related to the safety of the dam. There's an accountable executive officer here. That's typically at a corporate level. That supports the site management. At the site, there's a responsible site person that's supported by the engineer of record, who's not necessarily at the site all the time, and the independent tailings review board. You see this linkage here with the designer or designer of record that reports to the engineer of record, and I have a slide on that relationship later on. Then if the dam is in operation, there's an operations team, and if the dam is in construction, there's a construction team. There's a number of documents that have been developed related to governance and engineer of record. We first formalized the engineer of record concept in the CDA bulletin that we issued in 2014. The Geoprofessional Business Association in the United States then took that concept and advanced it further. The Mining Association of Canada did the same. When these two organizations made their progress, we in the Canadian Dam Association cycled back and did a major revision of our governance in Eor section of 2019. All of that was then used by the GISTM. So what was presented in GISTM is an extension of the previous work. As I said, the Eor concept was initially formalized in 2014 in our Mining Dams Bulletin in Canada. And it was done so to provide continuity. As Harvey said, at Mount Poly, there was 5 different engineers of record involved, and that was viewed as part of the problem with the facility. We saw the same at the Samarco Dam failure. There's other examples of that. So the EOR concept fundamentally was to provide continuity. It's related to the dam safety aspects of the site. It makes a big difference with risk management. It assists the overall risk management program on a site, and therefore improves the project performance of dam safety. This concept has been getting a lot of traction for tailings dams and for mining dams. In many places, there are many sites, there are a number of dams on a site, not just tailings dams. There can be water dams, water treatment dams, and so on. And many sites are now adopting EORs for all the dams on their sites, not just tailings dams. We also recognize that our colleagues in the water dam industry typically have this type of position as well, but they may not actually call it engineer of record. They may call it something like a dam safety engineer. But we believe that this concept can be applied to all dams. When we look at the dam life phases and the EOR involvement, the EOR should be involved from the initial design and construction through commissioning, and if there's further designs and construction for raises of the tailings dam, and out into closure. The question is often asked, is an EOR required for closure? And the answer is yes. So within the Icold document, we have a description of the engineer of record. We state the EOR is responsible for advising the owner and other appropriate stakeholders as to whether the TSF is designed with appropriate concern for health, safety, and environment, in alignment with the current state of practice and in accordance with applicable regulations, statutes, and guidelines. The EOR further advises the owner whether the construction of the facility conforms to the design concept and provides critical support during operations. Now, in the past, in the Mining Dams Bulletin of 2014 of CDA, we said that the EOR was responsible for the safety of the dam, and that's incorrect. The owner is responsible for the safety of the dam, and through these functions, the EOR provides support to the owner and effectively becomes a partner with the owner. So the Icold document provides more information on that. The Global Industry Standard on Tailings talks about it as well. There's obviously MAC and CDA has it, but the definitions are all very consistent. I indicated earlier how the designer of record and engineer of record may not be the same. There's many times the engineer of record is the same as the designer of record. Many times the engineer of record is the lead designer for a particular tailings dam or a raise, but not always. And there's many cases where the engineer of record delegates that responsibility to the designer of record. The designer of record is also referred to as a design engineer. Well, the designer of record is the one that's responsible for the design, stamps the construction drawings, specifications, and reports, and so on. And the design engineer, designer of record, then follows the construction. They provide the support during the construction, and they certify the as-built report. Now, if the designer of record is different than the engineer of record, the engineer of record may delegate that responsibility but cannot release that accountability. The engineer of record still retains accountability for the overall safety. And there's many different models for the roles of the designer of record and engineer of record that also account for the situation where the designer of record may be working for a different firm than the engineer of record. So the engineer of record should do the following. They should report to the owner concerns they have with respect to the dam. They should make sure that the dam system complies with regulatory reporting requirements. They should provide the owner input on planned or implemented changes, maintain practices consistent with the applicable standard of care, provide objective professional guidance with respect to innovative technologies. Some innovative technologies are suitable and others are not. The EOR should seek peer review for critical items and input from technical experts with necessary specialized knowledge. The EORs need to park their ego at the door. And the EOR should provide support for third-party reviews and ITRBs. The EOR is an integral part of the dam safety risk management team. As I said earlier, they're a partner. They are a trusted advisor. It can take time to develop that relationship. It may take 1 to 3 years to develop that relationship. But ultimately, you become a partner and a trusted advisor. The EOR is typically an individual supported by a firm and a team that has dam safety specialists. There are some areas where the EOR is viewed as a firm and not an individual. Within Icold, the GISTM, CDA, we clearly say the EOR should be an individual. But the individual is likely not going to be a sole practitioner. The individual needs to have a team of specialists supporting that EOR as they undertake their responsibilities. The EOR has to be insistent on working at a high technical level. And again, that requires the support from these dam safety specialists. The EOR is assertive of project requirements with the senior personnel in the EOR's firm. What that means is that the EOR is not by themselves. They need to be able to continue to represent the project requirements within their firm and make sure that they're obtaining the support from the senior personnel in the firm to be able to meet their responsibilities for the dam. And the EOR is capable of addressing a wide range of issues. The EOR is much more than a designer. The EOR has to deal with the operations, the maintenance, surveillance programs, closure, training, competencies, management. The EOR has to have an awareness of all those issues to be able to do their job. Now, the EOR is not that person that possibly is able to know everything about a TSF. The EOR is not on the site. The EOR is typically a consultant, and so they're not on the site. They can't know everything about the TSF, and so the people on the site, the responsible person and the team that supports the responsible person are integral to this, and that partnership is necessary to be able to handle all the issues about a TSF. The EOR is not the last person you call. The EOR is not the person that gets the phone call when there's a problem. Typically what happens now is that the EOR is advised early on. And our best day is when a client calls us and says, hey, we've got something a little different happening on our dam. We'd like to advise you about it. And the EOR says, I hear you. Thank you for your call, but it's really not a big deal. So many of the trigger action response plans will show the EOR being engaged very early on in their surveillance program when there's abnormal conditions observed. So they're not the last person. The EOR is not psychic. The EOR cannot read the owner's mind. So communication with the EOR is very critical, and typically they involve calls happening every week or every month with the client talking about the dam safety programs. The EOR is not an insurance policy. There's the concept of liability transference, where in some cases, owners have thought it was a good idea to hire an EOR to be able to access the EOR's company insurance policy. Said if there's a problem, well, hey, there's a bucket of money over there they go after. There is such a demand of EORs right now and such a shortage of EORs that all the consulting firms that are providing these services are looking at this very closely. If they see any sign of liability transference as being the motivation for this, they will not undertake those assignments. And the EOR is not a rubber stamp. So there are examples in cases where the owners have made changes to their operations manual, made changes to their surveillance practices, and then they say, hey, Mr. EOR, can you just look at that and approve it? No, it's not acceptable. The EOR should have been involved in the preparation of those changes. So I have two slides related to qualifications. The first is on the technical aspects, and the second is on the non-technical. From a technical perspective, the EOR needs to have the education, knowledge, and experience commensurate with the complexity and potential failure consequences. So when you read the MAC guidance and GIS-TM guidance, this is what it says. However, within CDA, we suggest there be a minimum of 10 years of related experience in dams engineering. And obviously that minimum of 10 years needs to be higher for dams that are in like the very high and extreme consequence categories. And as I said earlier, the EOR has to have a breadth of knowledge, not just design. So they need to understand construction and operations. Those are critical aspects in the education of the EOR. And many of the companies that have EORs and providing those services now are developing those training programs for their staff to be able to understand the different aspects of dam safety. EOR needs to have a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. Typically it's geotech. There are occasions when a hydrotechnical engineer may be able to take on the EOR role. It's not unusual. It's just, I think the vast majority of EORs are geotechnical engineers, and in particular high classification facilities warranting advanced degrees. EOR needs to have knowledge of the applicable local regulations and international practices, and they need to be in good standing in their local jurisdictions. Now, in many countries, there's a professional engineering registration process, and they need to have their PEng, or professional engineering designation. But not all countries in the world have that designation, so that's why we write the EOR needs to have good standing in their local jurisdiction. With respect to non-technical qualifications, the EOR needs good written and oral communication skills. They need to be able to generate trust from their peers and colleagues, other members of the community, and regulators. Many of our dams require multidisciplinary teams. They need to be able to lead that, able to go to site, courage to deal with dissenting commentary and firmly administer the design intent, which all requires a high degree of emotional intelligence. So I have two slides on engaging in EOR. The first is if the owner has a dam safety consultant in place and they wish to work with that dam safety consultant to identify a suitable candidate. So within the consulting firm, There may be someone that meets the qualifications of an EOR. They would be presented by the consulting firm to the owner. The owner may have an approval process in place to be able to come to an agreement that that individual is suitable as the EOR. Then there needs to be the team identified as well as a successor EOR. Contractual terms need to be defined, including the battery limits, which dams are in and out of the scope. The limits of liability is very important. We're aware of some companies, some owners, that are now waiving the limitations of liability from their contracts. They are not expecting the engineer of record firm to be held liable for problems associated with the dam. And they're doing that because they know that of the concern that many of the consulting firms have with regard to liability transference, and therefore their hesitation to become involved as engineer of record. And the companies that are waiving those limitations of liability are doing so because what they want to focus on is the partnership and trust aspects of the EOR and not have the elephant in the room related to liability issues. There should be a conflict resolution mechanism because there will be times when the EOR and the owner do not agree, and how should they be, what's the process for resolving those conflicts, as well as the conditions under which the EOR or the owner can opt out of the agreement. So all those things need to be sorted out. Then after that's done, moving through detailed reviews of the dams, investigations, and analyses. And even if you have a dam safety consultant in place, that dam safety consultant may not actually understand all the things that went on with that dam from its original construction. So in many cases, even though the dam safety consultant is in place, taking on the EOR responsibility requires detailed reviews. The RACI matrix needs to be done, and ultimately you're able to work as partners to manage the risks associated with dams and the facilities. So if there is not a dam safety consultant in place that you believe can meet the requirements of an EOR, but yet you may believe there's a suitable consulting firm that can do so, then work with that firm either through an RFP process or through invitation to identify the candidates, teams, successors. Contractual terms need to be sorted out, and then get into the detailed reviews. Now, in this particular case, that third bullet may take between 1 and 3 years before the EOR team and the EOR are satisfied that they understand enough about the dam, understand the risks associated with the dam, before they can formally take on the EOR role. Otherwise, it's the same as the previous slide. So the last slide of my presentation is here. The EOR concept is new, it's challenging. We have a number of items that we have to deal with as an industry. We need to provide further clarification of roles and responsibilities. How do we transition from one EOR to the next over time, particularly for these dams that are going to last forever? How do we make sure we have EORs forever? It's a daunting task. Succession of the EORs, because of the limited number of EORs that are available to meet the requirements in the industry, there are going to be requirements to have multiple firms involved in one site, which will have designers of record and engineers of record. How do we deal with that in an objective manner? The last 4 bullets deal with sustainability, maintaining qualified personnel, developing EORs, growing EORs, taking young engineers and presenting to them that this is an attractive career path and getting them excited about it so we can educate them, mentor, and apprentice them. So fundamentally, how do we make this a sustainable concept? So the Canadian Dam Association and the United States Society of Dams, we have now forming a working group to address these issues. We had 1 webinar in December of 2021. We have additional webinars and workshops planned for the upcoming year. So that is my presentation. David, Harvey?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Andy. And certainly the engineer of record is a key role in the safe management of dams. Now, in terms of the agenda here, we have planned to have a 5-minute question period. I'm not sure with the organizers how that is managed, but if people do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat messages, and eventually they should get over to us in the presenters website. So we'll wait a few minutes just to see, or a minute or so, just to see if there are any questions that people might have.
So is Kalpana there? Is our representatives of Icold with us? Or you guys are rather quiet.
I don't know, Andy.
So it'd be nice if we could get confirmation.
Is Icold on the call?
There's a name called Mohan that's on the line. Mohan, can you hear us?
I can hear you, Andy.
Is that Mohan from Alberta?
Yeah.
I thought it was you.
Good. How are you? How are you, Andy?
Well,
Yeah.
we're a bit perplexed, Mohan. You seem to be the only one with us.
And from the Central Board of Irrigation and Power, is there a representative there?
Like someone may be trying to come in, Harvey.
Okay, well, I think we may just press on.
Agreed.
And Annika Belka was going to talk on closure, but she hasn't connected yet. So we will switch the order, and we'll move on to David Brett with his presentation on understanding dam failure consequence categories. What, why, and how. David, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Harvey. I'll just get this screen share up, hopefully. For some reason it doesn't seem to be coming up now. So you can't see anything? It was working perfectly before?
Yeah, that's right, David. I'm not able to see. I just see your video.
Right. Right. Well, I don't know what's going on. I'm going to the PowerPoint. Sorry.
I have the PowerPoint, so if you want me to put it up, David, I can
Okay,
put
that'd
it
be
up
good.
and you could just
Okay,
follow.
thanks. Thanks, Harvey.
Okay. Sec here.
Okay. So that's good. So yeah, I'm going to talk about understanding dam failure consequence categories, which turns out to be a pretty controversial thing at the moment, but it's all good. So I won't go into any more detail about myself. That's a young version, because when I started figuring out how long I have been doing this tailings stuff. It doesn't bear repeating, but so that's a nice photo of a few years ago, not too many. So next slide. So what is a consequence category? And this is a system that we use to classify dams in accordance with the consequences of the failure. So around the world, there have been different ways to allocate dams as far as classification. And in some cases, this is just based on the height and the storage capacity. And there are some others that might be related to risk, but Icold think that the consequence category is the best way of doing this, where we're actually looking at the consequences of failure. And so a small dam could end up being a very high consequence category, whereas a large dam could be low or significant. So really the consequences are the most important thing. And historically what's been done is that you assume that a failure occurs and then we look at the consequences of that failure. And the reason we were doing this was to inform the designers, so to understand what the consequences might be, and the more significant those consequences were, well then the more important it is to design for different conditions and to operate the dams in a certain way. And a very important message is that consequence does not mean risk. So we're really only looking at the consequences if something did happen, and that something might be really remote, almost incredible. And I guess in the past, we were not really focusing too much on that credibility, but with the GISTM, we are really now looking at understanding that we need to be looking at credible failures. But by the same token, we don't need to look at the likelihood. So these events or the failures that we consider could be very, very low likelihood, almost unbelievable, but not quite. So this becomes a bit difficult, and it's probably something that we'll need to iron out over the next few years of using this new system. And I guess one of the issues might be, can we reduce the consequence category by designing? And potentially we could, but it really mean a change in the mode of a dam to change so that we don't have a credible failure mode that might have previously made it a higher extreme consequence. So next slide, please, Harvey. Yeah, so once again, just highlighting this, that high consequence category doesn't imply risk, and ideally, it's actually the opposite. So that we will do our consequence assessment, and if we determine we've got a high consequence category, well, that'll really focus all our attentions on making sure that we are using stringent design parameters and putting in very good operating controls, so that we make sure that the risks of the failure occurring is as low as possible, and so that the high consequence category still remains, but the risk is very low. With the Icold system, which is really based on the GISTM method, the factors that we're looking at don't involve the owner's costs, and they are something that the owners need to look at later. So these are really we're looking at the consequences to the community in terms of loss of life, environmental damage, and community infrastructure, and that will give you the consequence category. And then the owner might be saying, well, if my dam failed, it's going to be a huge impact on my business, so I'll actually change the up the design parameters and the operating procedures to a higher level, higher consequence category. Okay, thank you, Harvey. So how do we do this? So the first thing we have to do is to select some credible failure modes. So these are looking at the dam and working through what failure modes we might have. And once we determine failure modes, you assess the effects of the failure. And this could be done very simply. In a lot of cases, we don't need to have fancy computer models or things like that, and we can actually, it's pretty obvious what the consequences are going to be, unless there's some reason why you might have to go to fine tuning to really decide between one consequence category or the next one. You might not have to do a complicated analysis, but sometimes you do, and if you do, well, then you can set up a dam breach model and run a computer model to determine flood map flood areas and see where those floods will go, what sort of impact they're going to have on population, environment, and the community infrastructure. And once we see the extent of the flood, we've got rules that we've developed to be able to work through them and come up with a consequence category. Next slide, please, Harvey. So this is a pretty small writing, I imagine, unless you've got a nice big screen. But this is the Icold consequence category table that we've got. And what you can see on the left-hand side is the different consequence categories: low, significant, high, very high, and extreme, which corresponds with the GIS STM consequence categories. And we've got the same classification of the population at risk. And then there's also a column of the potential loss of life. And this is, I guess, Icold probably leaning to say that the population at risk method is pretty easy to determine. So you can once you know your flood mapping, where the tailings are going to go and the run out of tailings, you can assess the population at risk. When it comes to loss of life, it's much more difficult to determine, and there's a lot of factors that might determine what the potential loss of life might be in any event. But we've made a stab at those, and where loss of life is unlikely because of pretty low population and there might be other factors, that there's warning times or whatever, well then that might be a significant consequence. But once you start to get loss of life, you're going to go into high, and if you end up having likely loss of life, potentially between 10 and 100 people, well then you're into very high. And if you're going to have many people's life lost, well then you might be into the extreme. And then we have the items of environment, social, cultural, and infrastructure and economics. And we've got descriptions in each of those as to how you would decide whether it's high, very high, or extreme. And I won't bother going through that now, but we do vary slightly from what the GISTM has, but that's really only to do with, we think that some of the wording in the GISTM table is getting away from consequences and actually defining a condition, and we think that we really need to look at the consequences as a preference, but essentially it's the same. So next slide, please, Harvey. So there are some rules about looking at the population at risk. It includes people who live there, and then also there'd be people who might be temporarily in the flood zone. The habitat looks at different types of environmental conditions. The infrastructure and economics looks at indirect and tangible losses, but we don't actually include the losses of the owner, and so that is something that the owners might be able to add for themselves. And whenever I've been involved in a workshop where we're looking at a consequence category, I usually find the owners are more likely to be conservatively going up in their rating or their consequence classification than if you just had some design engineers by themselves. So next slide, please, Harvey. So what do we use this for? And as the dam designer, the main thing we use the consequence category for is to determine what the design parameters should be. So we have parameters for floods, seismic loading criteria, but also operational practices and risk assessment. So in particular, our flood criteria, if you have a low consequence category, you might be designing for a 1 in 200 flood, but as you go up to high, very high, and extreme, we're talking about probable maximum floods. And similarly with earthquakes, if we have low or significant consequence categories, we're looking at relatively low earthquakes, But as we get into the higher consequence categories, we're recommending much bigger earthquakes up to the extreme consequence category. We'd be looking at a probabilistic 1 in 10,000 earthquake, or a deterministic would be 84th percentile of a maximum credible earthquake. So the earthquake design gets a bit complicated, and we really need some specialist advice on that. But the message is that the higher your consequence category, the more severe earthquakes you should consider. And this is very important in tailings dams because of the potential for liquefaction. And then we also use this for some of our operational practices. So if you have very high or extreme consequence categories, we might be doing some much more frequent, comprehensive dam safety reviews and inspections, and a higher level of routine inspections. Okay, thanks, Harvey. So I guess the key thing under the new system is to identify credible failure modes. There's a couple of failure modes there on the right-hand side of the slide, and pretty obvious what's happening in those cases. But yes, this is the secret of determining a good consequence category, is to first of all identify the credible failure modes. So the sort of failure modes that we might consider would be instability due to foundation failure, where there's been could be caused by weak material, incorrect strength assumptions, incorrect seismic hazards, so bigger earthquakes than we were expected, and unexpected pore pressures. And I guess in this sort of focuses on, we really need to forget about likelihood. So we're not looking at something that might be, we might expect to happen fairly easily, and then talk ourselves into thinking that it's not going to happen, and so it's not credible. We really need to think that there could be factors like weak zones that we haven't interpreted properly, and so that does cause the failure. And if it did, well, what are the consequences? And when you do that, and you come around to finding that consequences are high or extreme, well, it focuses your attention that we really need to do a thorough geotechnical investigation to make sure you do understand the foundations as best as you can. But even if you do a very good one, it still doesn't mean that you couldn't miss something. So you're always going to have these credible failure modes, no matter how good a job of investigations or conservative designs and things like this. So then going on, instability. Oh, sorry, go back.
Sorry.
Go back. Yeah. So then instability of the slope of the dam, overtopping, and overtopping's a case of failure mode where we look at this historically, and it's been a pretty important failure mode for pretty much the whole history of tailings dams, and still going on today. So it is one of the serious failure modes that we need to consider. Erosion seems like it could be fairly minor usually, but if you have ongoing erosion, that could actually mean removal of parts of your dam, which could be the toe of the dam leading to failure, or it could be the face of the dam, which ended up, when it got bad enough, to lose the support of the tailings and cause liquefaction. And then the old chestnut piping, internal erosion, which, like that photo on the bottom right-hand corner, which brings pretty strong memories to me because that's one of my dams. So then structural failure, I've had also seen some pretty major cases of structural failure where failure of decants can lead to failure of a dam. And then one that we shouldn't forget, which is environmental release. So it's not actually a failure of the dam as such, but it's, or not a structural failure, but seepage of pollution into the environment can also be considered a failure mode. Thanks, Harvey. So we also need to think about the failure modes or potentially failure scenarios that could be several different failure modes occurring one after the other, which could then lead to the final release of tailings and water. So an example could be overtopping leading to erosion. Erosion leads to the embankment slumping. The embankment slump releases more stored water and slurry, and Harvey mentioned this, you know, a ton of tailing, a cubic metre of water could erode and take out a ton of tailings as a pretty normal approximation of what the liquid release might be. And that can cause erosion of the embankment, which could then lose support to the tailings, and the remaining tailings could then liquefy and flow. So you really have to think about the scenarios that could occur. Thanks, Harvey. So yeah, like I think Harvey mentioned it before, that tailings dam breaches can be very different to water dams. If there is water in the dam, well then potentially the initial flow of material out of the dam would be water, but potentially taking a lot of tailings with it. And this approximation of 50% solids density is quite often made. And once that occurs, we could then get a slump of higher density material. So there could be a liquid flow phase that would travel a long distance, and then there could be a more of a landslide type of failure mode that might be more localized, but very, very deep. So those things need to be looked at. We also do look at a couple of different cases for dam failures. First of all, a fair weather or sunny day failure, which is where there's no unusual water on the dam and there's no downstream flooding. So this would be pretty much normal operating conditions, and you'd need to look at what credible failure modes you might have in that situation. So that photo on the right, that's the Cadia Dam in Australia, and that is a good example of a sunny day failure. There was no water on that dam or nowhere near the failure. It was just a slump of material that occurred. But we also look at this rainy day situation. So we have a flooding conditions in the dam, which could lead to high water levels, and then there'd also be flooding in the downstream area. And we really need to, there's no real rule of which flood you should use. You've got to look at a few different cases, looking at what's the incremental effect of the flood. Thanks, Harvey. So we really have to remember that this is a developing science and we haven't got an agreed model methodology. And so we are definitely a lot of people developing models and you can probably buy some computer program that claim to do various things, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of variables and we really don't pretend to understand everything as yet. So we need a lot of engineering judgment when we're developing these dam breach models. We can vary from the very simplistic method where you might assume that everything was water and it flowed out like water, which is probably going to get you a very conservative extent of flood in terms of the area covered and the distance, but it's probably going to be very conservative and unrealistic. Thanks, Harvey. So once we've done this flood mapping, we can then define the inundation areas. We can count houses or look at populations or industries that are in the flood zone and estimate the population at risk. We can also use various methods to calculate the potential loss of life, and this is very influenced by warning time. We have to be careful we don't use some of the rules that are developed for water dams, because in water dams, I think there's depth of water less than 0.5 metre and flowing at less than 1 metre a second. People think that you might be it might be unlikely to wash people over and cause them to drown or lose their life. But I think you have to recognise the tailings are different and they're much denser and more force involved. So I think we just need to be careful not to use some of these water flood criteria. And then we also have to look at the damage to the environment and the community infrastructure, etc. Thanks, Harvey. One of the other uses for dam breach analysis is for emergency planning. So I think there's a bit of debate that can go in about this. What dam breach should you use for your emergency planning? And I think as far as emergency planning goes, it's probably not necessary to use the most, or the credible failure mode that is very extreme. If you've done your designs and can handle a probable maximum flood or something like that, you might be able to come up with a flood or a seismic event or a failure of whatever kind that is maybe more realistic in terms of doing your inundation mapping for emergency planning. So you just need to do a bit of sensitivity analysis to looking at different flood cases to see what's a realistic thing to look at for your emergency planning. Things you might consider in that when you're looking at your flood extent would be warning times, warning methods, safe areas, emergency access and escape routes, response method and equipment needs, and lists of agencies and contact details. So, once again, just a matter of developing a emergency plan based on some realistic scenario, rather than something that is pretty much very, very unlikely. It depends on, you might need to consider the effect of that, but make sure you plan your resources appropriately. Okay, thanks, Harvey. So after all that, this is my last slide, the take-home messages. The consequence category is a design operational tool. I guess what's happening now these days with the GISTM is that the public are getting more involved. So the consequence category is something that does become publicly known. So we need to be educating the public to understand what that really means, that it shouldn't be related to risk, and needs to be taken as what is the worst possible outcome, but hopefully we can demonstrate to the public that the consequence category has been used to drive down the risk so that it's very, very low for some of these extreme consequence dams. And it's important, in my opinion, when we're considering the consequence category that we don't try and drive it down to try and reduce that public outcome. And it's really, if we've got an extreme consequence dam, well, we should recognise it and develop our designs appropriately. It'd be silly to try and drive that category down so that we ended up with lower design parameters and actually left it with a higher risk than otherwise. So, and to me, having a conservative consequence category allows decision making to reduce risk, and that's what it's really all about. So thank you, Harvey. That's the presentation on that. So if there are any questions, please to answer them.
Thanks, David. We'll just wait a moment or two to see if there are any questions.
So I think we're pretty much on program.
Yes. Now we still have one of our presenters, Annika Belkovich. Maybe she's having trouble getting connected. I'm not sure. And I see Jiri, you're online now. Would you be able to present your presentation next? You're on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm online. I can present anytime you wish, Harvey.
Okay. Well, I think I don't know if we're going to get. I don't think we're going to get any questions, and if we do, people can save them up. And if you have questions and you're online, put them into your chat box, and either we'll answer them during this session, this workshop, or we'll respond after the workshop if we're not able to, if we run out of time. So please do think about questions and feel free to add questions to us, because certainly we would like to communicate and give you ideas about different things and questions you may have. So I think Annika was going to talk about closure, but she may be having trouble. So we are going to go on to the presentation on slope stability analysis for tailing dams. So Jerry Hirza is going to present this. He's been a key focus of his rather. And I guess Jerry, I don't really know, but I assume you're studying it as well at the university in Czechoslovakia. But anyway, I'll turn it over to Jerry and I'll let you give your presentation, Jerry.
Thanks, Javi. Let's get into it. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. I had some IT issues earlier, but should be resolved. I don't see the slides yet. Still can't see.
So Jerry, do you want me to put the slides up? I don't think the host has shown up yet.
Let's see if you can turn the slides out, because I have no idea how to do it. I had enormous issues even to get in. So
Okay.
if you could just open the slides, you might have the slide pack already.
Okay. Well, I'll get
how
your.
to share.
Just bear with me now. I get the slide.
Just give it a sec.
So I'll share the screen.
Okay, I can see it now. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Javi. Let's get into it. As Javi said, I'm currently in Czech Republic, finishing my PhD studies into soil mechanics, closely related to tailing slope stability. Don't want to talk too much about myself. Let's move on to the next slide. So today, I'll be presenting a short presentation on slope stability assessment. I will go through why slope stability for tailings is important. We'll explain some of the key principles of the assessment, what inputs we need, what methods we use, how we assess the outcomes of risk analysis, and I'll briefly touch on uncertainties and risks associated with our slope stability assessment. If you can, okay. So, slope stability is one of very common causes for tailings failure. And in the last decade, slope instabilities resulted in deaths of more than 300 people, contamination of very many square kilometers of land and long stretches of rivers. And they indeed have astronomical direct and indirect economical losses. What's important when we run stability assessment is to understand that it's not just a calculation. The calculation is part of the process of the assessment, but the assessment itself is a number of steps joined together. First, we have to understand the site conditions. We have to understand the relevant failure modes and consider those in our assessments. We then run through the stability assessment calculations, the stability analysis, and then we need to consider the outcomes of the stability assessment. So when we put together a ground model, we basically compile all relevant site conditions. So the ground model is a reference point that is being used to feed information about our site to our slope stability assessment. After we set up the ground model, which contains information about the geology, geotechnical conditions, seismicity, hydrogeology, groundwater table, and other important factors of our site, we can go into, you are going way too fast, Harry. Okay, thank you. We then go into a slope failure selection, because we need to understand what cross-sections and what parts of the tailings dam we might want to consider for slope stability. Different sites, different locations, or breaches in those locations might have different consequences. So selection of the sections and geometries which we are going to analyze is very important. Then we go through the slope stability cases for those different consequences, and we implement them in a geotechnical design model. The geotechnical design model is a modification of the ground model, and the modification is in the adoption of the geometry we are interested in, and in the material zoning that is relevant to our failure mode and the location of our assessment. So from ground model, we go to a geotechnical model, and then we can, once we have the geotechnical model assembled, we can go and run the stability analysis. So the stability analysis is the numerical evaluation of what of the performance of the slope stability of our dam based on the geotechnical design model we have selected. The calculations might be run in a number of environments. We can run a limit equilibrium, which is still the most common software package or method used. We can use finite element analysis or finite difference analysis, depending on the input parameters and importance of the structure and what we want to get out of our analysis. Next one. The next step in the slope stability assessment, after evaluating the factor of safety or deformations of our slopes of interest, we have to evaluate those results. So what evaluation typically involves is a comparison of the results with the minimum or target requirements taken from international guidelines, bulletins, or local requirements defined by government. And in our draft tailings bulletin, we suggest that the minimum factors of safety are as per the table now shared on the screen. For the static drained conditions, we target factor of safety of 1.5. For peak undrained conditions as well, and the post-seismic and post-liquefaction using residual strength or post-liquefied strength of the tailings, we have a range of 1.1 to 1.3 with the higher factor of safety required for cases where we have high uncertainty in the shear strength parameter we use for the post-liquefaction case. What is important, next slide please. What is important in our slope stability in inputs? Indeed, the inputs are typically material, zoning, and geometry. The different materials within our selected geometries have certain properties. We have to set boundary conditions for our model, and the design loads on the left-hand side of the slide. You can see a case of a dam with a starter dam and a number or series of upstream raises. You can see a ferritic line in blue and two failure surfaces. One is drained and one is undrained. So this is a simplified set of input parameters for a conventional slope W limit equilibrium assessment. The undrained and drained slip surfaces are the results of the assessments are just showed for completeness of the picture. At the start of the assessment, we rarely know what the failure slopes might look like, and it's part of the software package that tells us where they might develop. Indeed, using different boundary conditions, we can modify the shape and the location of those slip surfaces, and that's why it's so important to define the boundary conditions properly. Out of those inputs for the stability assessments, I'll talk about material properties. In the next slide, because the material properties are very, very important, and ill-selected material characteristics for slope assessments might result in disasters. So what's important when we select the right inputs is to check that the geotechnical design model captures the behaviors and properties of the soil properly, and to be able to realistically assess slope stability of tailings dams and other structures, we really need to understand basic geotechnical behaviors of our common soil or altered tailings. And the key considerations are the drain versus undrained shearing, dilative versus constructive behavior, and the strain stress response of the soil during shearing. Next one. So the difference between the drained and undrained shearing is crucial. And the assumption is that under drained shearing, we will have constant pore water pressure, irrespective of how long we shear the material. That drain conditions are typically used for unsaturated soils, where there is little water content within the soil matrix, or for soils where it's certain that the permeability will dissipate any pore water pressures that might be caused by external loading. The opposite of drain condition is the undrained conditions, also called constant volume shearing. Under these conditions, the initial pore water level changes as the shearing occurs. And the generation of shear-induced pore water pressures might severely impact the slope stability, because the shear resistance of our soil is directly proportional to the normal stresses acting on the soil aggregate. Any increase in pore water pressure reduces those normal stresses and then results in reduced shear resistance of the soil. So for any assessment, it's crucial to understand the likelihood or the potential for undrained conditions to develop. Next one. The next crucial difference between different soil behaviors is the dilative versus constructive response during shearing. While dilative materials, by definition, are increasing their volume upon shearing, constructive materials are reducing their volume during shearing. And in soil mechanics, this definition have been extended to indicate the pore water pressure development during shearing as well. So dilative materials are materials that, when sheared, expand their volume if they're sheared in drained conditions. In undrained conditions, because the shearing is at constant volume, the volume cannot increase, and therefore dilation means reduction of pore pressures during undrained shearing. The opposite is contractive shearing, that indicates a reduction of volume during drained conditions, where the soil matrix can densify, and contraction under undrained shearing indicates increased pore pressures because the particles cannot move closer together to allow for shear development, because the material is not drained, and therefore contraction of undrained materials results in excess pore pressures. The very common theory used in soil mechanics and indeed in tailings engineering is a critical soil mechanics, which is typically presented in a 2D or 3D plots of key state variables of the soil. On the right-hand side of this slide is shown a typical plot between mean effective stress and void ratio of a soil, which is split by a critical state locus onto two sides, one shown the contractive and one is dilative soils. You went backwards? Okay, next one. The last important element of soil behavior understanding is a strain stress response. So what that means is we need to understand what happens as the materials are, or as the soils are being sheared, and axial strains or any shear strain is developing. Some soils, upon shearing, are increasing their shear resistance due to the internal changes of the soil matrix. On the left-hand side, you can see a typical shear stress and strain plot that indicates several behaviors that might occur within our dams, and the worst or the very dangerous situation is shown by the red line that indicates a rapid increase in shear resistance shown by shear stress, followed by a rapid reduction. And it goes to, let's say, 20% of the peak shear resistance towards the end of shearing at large strains, large deformations. If we have such conditions on our side, we have to be super careful not to get too close to the peak, because once the shearing takes the soil beyond the axial strains required or achieve, when the peak shear strength is achieved, the material can degrade very quickly and lead to quick failure of the slope. To assist practitioners in tailings industry, we have attempted to map the most critical slope stability cases, which is on the next slide, Harvey. And we have split the typical situations we might come across while preparing slope assessments of tailings dam into 4 categories, and the category 4 is then further split into subcategories. What's shown on this slide is the slope assessment of existing tailings storage facility. And on the right-hand side, you see that the first question we suggest everyone to ask is whether we have contractive material present on site. If we believe that contractive material are presented on site, this flow chart and the supporting explaining text that takes you through the assessment and step by step and suggest the methods you should be using and the input parameters they should be applied in the slope assessment. So, for example, if the first question is answered by yes, we have contractive materials present, then we move right on the diagram shown on the right hand side of the slide. And the first question is followed by a second, which says, are contractive soils strain softening? Go okay, yeah. And if you say they are not, because we have done all the tests indicating the materials, when we shear them, they don't lose strength, which is the indication of strain softening. So we can use case number 1. And on the left-hand side, there is a summary what case number 1 might mean. For case number 1, where strain softening was not shown, but we have contractive response, we can then we suggest that the peak undrained shear strength should be used for the stability assessment with a target factor of safety of 1.3, and indeed we must comply with the minimum factor of safety for drain conditions of greater than 1.5. Similarly, we can go through the diagram in cases 2 and 3, but being mindful of the time, we can jump onto case 4, which is the worst case scenario we might have, and it indicates that we indeed have undrained conditions existing, we have contractive materials, there are strain softening, and they can reduce their strength very rapidly, as shown by the stress strain behavior. When that occurs, we're getting into a zone when we have to consider the factor of safety for post liquefied or post-peak shear strength that should be greater than 1.1. If we comply with the factor of safety greater than 1.1, then we are in case 4A, and we have to check for peak undrained and peak drain conditions to also comply with the minimum factors of safety, which are in this case greater than 1.5. However, if we can guarantee that the factor of safety for the weakened soil is greater than 1.1, then we have to judge whether the stability is still safe or satisfactory for further operations of the facility, and should the facility have greater consequence than intermediate, then it's probably appropriate to undertake remedial measures to comply with the minimum factors of safety, because any change in the loading conditions might take the dam to a danger zone of self-propelled reduction of shear strength that would lead to uncontrolled release of tailings. Indeed, if the consequence of the tailings dam failure is low, then we can undertake risk assessment to justify not compliance with the minimum factors of safety. Next one, please. I'll touch on the key uncertainties and the associated risks. So for the selection of our slope stabilities, we must define the geometry and the zoning of the soils. And for tailings dams, the zoning is not always that clear, because previous deposition might not be fully recorded, and the distribution of various tailings within our tailings dams might be quite heterogeneous. So in different cross sections, we might have still the same tailings, but of different fraction. The soil behavior is certainly not 100% understood. So we have to be mindful that conditions within the tailings are constantly changing. We are depositing tailings, increasing water levels and reducing water levels, increasing shear stresses by building different geometries. Indeed, the tailings dam design changes very often throughout their life, so it's very important to capture those changes in the stability models. The loading conditions are uncertain, especially for very extreme and unlikely events, such as earthquake, which might have on its own an error bound of 1 order of magnitude, and the boundary conditions as well are associated with significant uncertainties due to potentially different, let's say, water conditions downstream of the dam. Next one. The consequence of those uncertainties that are that we either overestimate the slope stability, which will result in uneconomical design, and the clients and owners might not be happy, or worst case, we overestimate the slope stability, and then it might result in the need of additional works if the facility cannot be safely operate, or worst case scenario in potential failure. So therefore, we suggest that uncertainty in slope stabilities assessments should be captured and communicated to allow for risk-informed decision by the owners and operators of the facility. And it can be done by sensitivity or probabilistic presentations of the results with a careful explanation. Next one. You can find by studying the uncertainties and their impact, you can find that that certain input parameters have a progressive development of their error bounds. And on the right hand side, you have a picture showing that the 20% change in 2 input parameters for one slope stability assessment resulted in 120% change. In this case, it was overestimation of the factor of safety. Next one. Being mindful of these uncertainties and the potential consequences of those, we have to understand that the factor of safety is not going to save us. The factor of safety is there to allow for reasonable uncertainty, and accounts for uncertainties in variability of the dam foundations, components, zoning. But it does not allow for fundamental misunderstanding of the soil behavior or omission of critical parameters and conditions. And indeed, it does not account for poor construction practices. And that's the last slide of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, please ask now, or you can communicate those to us during our session today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jerry, for a good presentation on the simplistic elements of soil mechanics. Thank you. Now, I don't know if we do have any questions yet. We seem to have not a good connection with respect to questions from the audience. Our next speaker, so I will move on. Annika Belkovic was going to join, but there may be IT problems with her. And I believe, Andy, that you indicated that you may present her or give her presentation, and David Brett will assist where appropriate, just to because he was working with Annika on that section. Is that the path forward, just to confirm?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just I'll have to just get that.
No, I've got it, Harvey, and I believe I'm sharing now.
Okay, good, thanks.
Okay, yes, so Annika Belkovic had prepared this, and so David and I are going to step in and just run through it. So in terms of an outline, what do we mean by closure? How do we plan for closure? How can we create value from closure planning? Some design and operational aspects, some of the responsibilities related to closure, what's considered the state of the art with respect to closure, and a brief summary. So what do we mean by closure? Icold Bulletin in 2013, B153, provided information on sustainable design and post-closure performance of tailings dams. It's a go-to document for closure. I use it quite regularly. And it has this statement: closure is defined as the planned final cessation of tailings disposal and the modification engineering of the tailings dam with the objective of achieving long-term physical, chemical, ecological, and social stability and a sustainable, environmentally appropriate after use. And that's the targets we're trying to achieve. In that Icold Bulletin, there had been a design life of 1,000 years stated, but really we're talking about the next ice age of perpetuity. The point was we're designing for a very long time. If we look at risk levels over time, so the y-axis here is risks and unknowns. The red line on the top shows risk reduction over the operational life of the mine, within addressing things at closure or not, and allowing the risks to increase. However, if through good planning and good closure planning from the beginning, it's possible to continue to reduce the risks of the operation over the life of the mine, so at closure the risks are brought to a very low level. So the idea is to plan for closure and manage the closure risk during all phases of the life cycle of a tailings dam, a tailings storage facility. So many mining companies are doing this now. They're integrating their closure planning within their life of mine plan. I'm going to speak to the financial aspects of it a little later, but that's one of the big challenges we're still dealing with as an industry. A lot of mining companies would like to do this, but there are still some challenges. There may be impacts or synergies with other aspects, such as remining, or how can waste streams from the mine be used effectively to support closure. The final landscape, what can be done to shape the landscape during the mining operations to achieve the final end targets, and then what land and water use will be in the land ownership. There's the concept of custodial transfer, whereby the mining operations or lease might be on a government property that then is transferred back to the government at the end of the operation after a closure period. That doesn't happen very often, but there's a desire to make that happen. And really that can only be achieved through meeting these stability requirements: physical, chemical, ecological, environmental, social. And then how are the closure costs built into the full cost of tailings production and disposal? I think we're all aware about how a number of mining operations that were once viable in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s would truly not have been viable if they'd included the closure costs within their mining budgets. So it's really important that the full cost of tailings production and closure be captured, so that the true cost profile of the mining operation is declared. So again, I'd shown this graphic back in the engineer of record presentation, but it starts with the planning of the mine and working through the closure throughout the operations and so on. And then we have these terms: transition, active care, and passive care. So after the operation is complete, there will be a period of transition where the mine is modified, the tailings are modified to achieve the closure configuration. There may be a period of time of active care through either water treatment operations or by maintenance of the facility for erosion and sort of things, which is active care, where there's a full-time site presence. And ultimately, we're trying to get to a passive care condition, which is not necessarily walk away, and that's addressed in a later slide. So is it possible to create value through closure? How can we take land that is initially undisturbed and turn it back to a natural landscape? There's often communities or towns that are growing up around the mine, and how can that land be used for something So David, maybe it'd be appropriate for you to comment on these examples that you and Annika have provided.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Andy. So I guess this first one, Northumberlandia, Lady of the North, is a reshaped overburden dump in England, northern England, and whether you like it or not, it's a pretty interesting example of how you could actually plan some mining structures to end up being almost an artwork at the end. This particular one has public access walks and lakes, and it's a pretty interesting example. And then many people have heard of the Eden project, where a clay pit has turned into a pretty amazing site with different venues and focusing on environmental issues. And then on the right there is an international hotel in China, which is made a pretty amazing backdrop from an old mining pit. So that's probably 3 good examples of where mines themselves can be turned into something in the end that has people looking after them and sharing the liabilities ongoing. So let's go to the next slide. I think I'll talk about a couple of tailings ones. So the same thing, not quite as impressive probably, but for tailings dams themselves, there's been quite a few different uses that have been made of those. In Australia, pretty commonly we would look at turning a tailings dam into a viable agricultural facility, and particularly grazing. Also in Australia, the Kidston mine in North Queensland has been turned into a solar power station, where we've got a combination of pumped hydro and solar panels to utilise old mine workings, and the solar panels are put on the tailings dam, so it's a pretty innovative use. In Arizona, there's a mine park that has been used for recreation. I think it might currently be closed because of mining developments, but it has been pretty well known in the past. And around the world, there's several golf courses that have been developed on tailings dams, and this one in Montana is pretty famous because it's got black slag bunkers. It'd be pretty interesting to play on that one. So
that is neat, David.
yeah, thanks, Andy. That's those.
That's good. Thank you. So when we're looking at creating value, who can be involved in that process? Well, there's obviously the mining company with their engineers and hydrologists and chemists and so on. But we're seeing more and more other specialists being brought into the mix, such as landscape architects. And I'm going to show you a slide a little later on a new outfit called Landform Design Institute. Artists and historians, things we wouldn't have thought about 20 years ago, are being brought in. When you look at the image David showed in the 2 slides earlier, that's not something engineers would typically have created. And then how do we interact with the community and the regulatory authorities and the other stakeholders to actually achieve a closure configuration that adds value? Obviously, that requires meaningful communication throughout, engaging the people, and it's engaging people in the early stages. In Canada, we have a situation with our First Nations where they're very involved in our closure plans, and we have to actually develop certain vegetation types as part of our closure landscapes to satisfy the First Nations requirements for traditional ecological knowledge. So it's a very cross-disciplinary atmosphere that you work within to achieve a closure these days. So does it actually solve the problem? Well, if we can get to the physical criteria, there are ways to deal with the physical aspects. And in fact, within the Canadian Dam Association, we're developing guidance on which structures you would no longer need to consider as a dam. And that would be great from a physical stability perspective. But even if structures are still dams, they can still be considered quite stable with suitable factors of safety and good hydraulic controls and so on. So physical stability does not always mean a non-dam, but protecting from erosion and settlement is important. Chemical stability, that's dealing with groundwater seepage, particularly. because at closure, typically you're dealing with the surface water discharges that meet the discharge requirements and natural environment requirements. So there may still be a groundwater seepage issue, which could be viewed as a chemical instability. Environmental stability comes back to the water quality largely, but there's also dust. Ecological, that's the land use, flora, fauna, and so on. And the social stability, those are the examples David showed earlier. Then what is the actual end use, golf course or not? How does the long-term responsibility change over time, and who becomes responsible for the maintenance? It's this issue of custodial transfer again. Many jurisdictions are very reluctant to take back mines. It is happening in some cases. And who takes that responsibility if the jurisdiction doesn't take the mine lease back? Let's move on. So the closure intentions can inform the planning design and will influence the design factors. So there needs to be at least a conceptual closure plan done at the beginning, and then the design, construction, operations over the life of the mine are done to fulfill the closure criteria. Again, looking at these requirements, physical, chemical, ecological, and social stability, how are they met? Well, different technologies are available, and we often hear about filtration and dry stacking as being a panacea. It's great in some cases, but not in all cases. For acid generating tailings, processing can be undertaken to remove the sulfides, but yet you still have the high sulfide material that has to be dealt with. So there's these great technologies that are out there. Co-disposal with tailings and rock is helpful, but not all of them work for all conditions, and they have to be evaluated on a site-specific basis. Planning a landform. I wish to speak about the landform term for a moment. The landform term that's being used here is really speaking to the shape of the surface at the end of the facility, at the end of the life. Drainage patterns and non-erodible surfaces, and having it shaped so it may look like the natural terrain. There is sometimes the term landform is being used for those structures which would no longer be considered a dam, which have no liquefiable contents within them. But truly, I think the term landform is best saved for the surface features at the end of the day. You could put all these great features on top of facilities which still have liquefiable elements in them, still would meet the definition of a dam, but you can still make it look like the natural terrain. Then there would be trials to test different techniques, particularly vegetation. And then there's performance targets, which may vary during active care and passive care phases. So I just added this slide in of an interesting organization called the Landform Design Institute. It's a fellow named Gordon McKenna. He's running it out of Canada. And his experience is largely from the oil sands, but he's bringing that to the world. And his mission statement is interesting: to make landform design routine in the mining industry worldwide by 2030. And he's working with a number of mining companies now to actually have them embrace the concept of landforming from the very beginning. So here is a closed tailings facility. His graphic picture here is a closed tailings facility, which has a certain shape with a water pond and so on, which is a landform that was designed from the beginning. In terms of the responsibility for closure, we have to recognize that mining companies are temporary users of the land, and that after we're done, it's society, community, and nature. We need to lead the process, but then the communication and so on needs to be undertaken with all the different stakeholders to make sure that the handover is effective. All parties must make an effort to understand each other and see the challenges from all points of view. For example, some stakeholders need to recognize that certain demands may make the mine uneconomic. Is that necessary? That needs to be sorted out. So the decision on the final land use is a shared responsibility, where the mining is holding the initiative, as there would be no need for closure if there was no mine. So from an aspirational goal perspective, it would be great if all of our facilities could be closed in a manner that had no potential for catastrophic flow failure modes. no potential for flow failure scenarios, no credible failure mode, and we would be able to classify the facility as a stable and non-contaminating landform. Our challenge is related to those facilities that contain acid-generating tailings or metal leaching potential and require saturation. Now, there are technologies that can deal with that, such as sulfide removal, dry covers, and so on, but they cost a heck of a lot of money. Many companies are still making their decisions based on a net present value model, which ends up making long-term care and maintenance a more attractive financial option. Some companies are dealing with their financial models differently. They're saying we are not going to net present value. We're going to take the total cost of the closure and see how that works. And that gets to be an incredibly large number. Until we as an industry come up with a good financial model that can help put good closure technologies into the right context, it is still going to be a challenge for us as designers to achieve these aspirational goals. That's still a challenge we have to deal with, because we'd love to get there, but we've got to convince the accountants. Could we get to walk-away solutions? Yes, they're possible. A walk-away implies remediation of the land used by mining operations is stable without any ongoing maintenance, allowing the miners to relinquish responsibility. Now, if the closure design leaves a dam behind, a structure that may still qualify as a dam, then we can never be a walk away. It would never move from passive care because the dam still needs to be inspected and maintained, dam safety reviews and so on. But if we could get to a situation where there's no dams, i.e. stable, there's no maintenance, then this walk away is possible. But it still is probably unrealistic, given all the different things that are going on around us with the natural processes. And then the whole bit about human intervention. There are examples around the world where there have been facilities that have been closed, but then somebody has a great idea to go in and use that facility again for other reasons, and in fact, remine it. David, is that something you'd like to comment on?
Well, probably not particularly, but I guess that is a potential that mining companies will always think that is the case. So they will be tending not to seriously consider the closure.
Oh, okay.
But, yeah.
So they use that as an excuse not to do certain things?
Or potentially.
I see, okay. Mm-hmm. So sustainable closure is likely to require the knowledge of the closed site at a minimum of some level of management. For most sites, we recognize aftercare is going to be necessary. The objective then is how do we minimize the amount of active care? So in terms of state of the art, there's lots of documents out there. There's lots of initiatives going on. The Tailings Dam Safety Bulletin that we're writing will not repeat all of that, but it will emphasize what we can. And fundamentally trying to remind the designers and the owners that we need to identify a feasible closure plan in parallel with developing a tailings disposal methodology and planning for closure through all phases of the life, including constructing and operating the facility towards closure. So the current practice, closure is often planned separate or parallel to design and operation, but even the GIS TM calls for a fully integrated approach that provides design support and stewardship throughout the life of the mine and beyond. So closure should always be the overarching guide with the ultimate aim of establishing a stable structure, reducing risks, and ideally relinquishment of the mining leases. So there are no other operations moving so many tons of material. How can we use those materials effectively? That's it, Harvey.
Yeah, I suppose if I could just add something, Andy. I guess the people who are listening to this might have got a bit of an impression that, or wouldn't have got the impression that we wanted to maintain originally, that our Icold committee thinks that closure is a really, really important thing, and that's why we've put it up front. And so we were intending to have the closure presentation early on in the piece to highlight this.
Oh,
and
good point, yes.
Yeah, and
it's like chapter 3 in our bulletin, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that that last slide sort of highlighted that it's about time we got real about it. And even if you are thinking that it's going to be remined, there's still no excuse not for coming up with a closure plan on the assumption that it might not be remined. And I guess we can't predict the economics of the future, so we've really got to seriously think what are we leaving for the future generations, and really put an effort into planning the closure right from the start.
Yeah, good, David. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy, for filling in for Annika. You're probably not as pleasant looking as she is, but you did a good job.
You're absolutely right, Harvey. No offense taken.
And thanks, David, for giving it some additional depth. And certainly, closure is if you can't close a mine, then what's the point of mining? So obviously, I think it's a important issue that if you do it at the beginning and plan for it, it can be done very successfully. If you do it at the end, it can be painful and expensive. So I guess we better move on here. So maybe, David, our next talk is on hydrotechnical design, tailings dams. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, in view of the difficulty I had, I could try and do it again, but it might be just as easy if keep you awake on your toes, and if you could show the presentation.
Oh, okay, I'll just, okay, here, I've got it. I'll share the screen.
Okay. You don't need to show my handsome face anymore.
No, I'll put on my...
Flick past that.
Does that work for everybody?
Yep, that's good.
Oh, got your introduction again. Well,
yeah,
fast.
you can flick past that. So, okay, so I've said here that water and tailings are inseparable. I guess process people would say that's not true, but what I really meant that you can obviously separate water from tailings, but when we're thinking about designing for tailings and what have you, we really have to consider them both. The water is a really fundamental part of designing with tailings. But we are often thinking about dry stacking these days as the panacea, like Andy said. But when you look closely at dry stacking, it's really filtered material. There's still got quite a lot of water. But the best we can do, probably still what we might think is wet of optimum in terms of a compaction for soil mechanics type of approach. So we're still dealing with water. And I guess the important thing that I realised when I was looking at some of the Icold Bulletin 121, I think it might be, on tailings dam failures, which is partly reproduced in this figure on the right-hand side, that water is responsible for a huge amount of the failures that we've had over the years. And on that particular diagram, which the data has been extended for another decade past the Icold Bulletin, you can see that the yellow material, the yellow shading represents water management failures. And so that you can see the proportion of failures, the different failure modes that are covered there. It starts at the bottom of the brown with slope instability, then seepage, foundation failures, then overtopping, which is what we're talking about, then structural and erosion and earthquakes. But the yellow one is overtopping, which could be summarised as water management, has been a large number of failures caused by that, and even in current times it's still the same. So if we go to the next slide, please, Harvey. And I guess when you look at how much water is in tailings, it's pretty surprising. Even when you see what looks like a solid material, it's really got a huge amount of water in. So these diagrams on the right are approximate scale models of different types of slurries. And the initial one is what you might have in a process plant, something like 20% solids. And these are by volume rather than by weight on these diagrams. So we can we can get an exaggerated feeling by looking at the solids content by weight, and when we look at it by volume, it's really, there's more water than you think. So even going down to those very dense slurries, there's still a lot of water, or even not dense slurries, but dense tailings materials, there's still a lot of water in them. And then, oops, before you go past that one, the water storage capacity in the dams is always being reduced by putting the tailings in, so that we've really got to keep our wits about us, keeping enough storage in the dams if we do want to store the water. But I guess we've got the competing requirement that we really don't want to have water in the dam for safety. So we've got a balance between what we're trying to keep in the dam and what we're trying to release from the dam. And often the quality of the water is very important because of the environmental situation. And we usually have some sort of regulator requirement for storing water, because the regulator doesn't want to release water into the environment, and so there quite often are requirements to store a very large amount of water on dams just to stop pollution from the sites. But in the consequence of that, we potentially make our dams more unsafe. So go to the next slide. So typically we have typical wet tailings disposal. We're trying to have a minimum water pond for settling fines. Then we want to have some temporary storage for normal seasonal flows. So we don't want to spill water every time it rains. So we need to have some sort of storage capacity. Sometimes if we're in cold climates, and obviously India is probably not one of these, we want to account for ice formation. And we might want to store environmental water. We might want to store water during a flood of a certain size to stop release of water that might cause an environmental impact. We also want to make sure that we don't risk failing the dam in a design flood, which we call the inflow design flood. And so that's typically what we would use to size a spillway. Next slide. So the inflow design flood is very important, and we did speak about that using the consequence assessment, the consequence category, to decide what flood we might want to use. There might be some other method of using risk assessment to determine what flood you want, but typically we use our consequence category. So the inflow design flood is the flood we use for sizing our spillway and outlet works for extreme flood storage. And typically they would be determined in terms of their annual exceedance probability, or AEP. So the problem is, when we're talking about very extreme floods, it's very difficult to predict them, and in most places in the world, we only have 100 years or maybe a bit more in some parts, but still relatively short in terms of the record related to extreme events that we're trying to size. So extending our historical floods into the future for estimating very large floods is very difficult. So next slide, please. So for the Icold recommendations for the inflow design flood are slightly different to the GISTM, but only in terms of we think that we should be using the PMF, whereas the GISTM was considering a 1 in 10,000. But when you look closely at this, because of the uncertainties, they're probably not that much different in terms of what the intention is. So I'll just go to the next slide. I think it shows what I'm talking about here. So this chart on the right shows design estimates for rainfall of different annual exceedance probabilities, and our records on the left-hand side of the chart are only between say up to 100 years of record, where we can get good rainfall data, and we can predict the rainfall for large flood events from maybe 1 in 50 to 1 in 100 type AEP. And then we can extend that historical data to predict floods up to, say, 1 in 2,000 AEP. But once we get higher than that, to predict from historical rainfall records, it becomes there's just too much unknowns. And so we have a method of working out the probable maximum precipitation using scientific consideration of the atmosphere and how much water it can hold at different locations and different conditions, and get an idea of the actual extreme rainfall that could occur, and then we can interpolate between those to work out probable very, very large events. But it becomes very difficult to know, to talk about the difference between a 1 in 10,000 or a 1 in a million type of event. So I think we just have to recognise this uncertainty and be conservative if what we use. Okay, next slide. The question of spillway versus storage is a pretty interesting one, and obviously with the water dam we were able to provide a spillway to take care of the floods, but often in our tailings dams there's pressure not to release water under any circumstances, and so this leads people to have to consider storing water in the dam for effectively the same condition that a spillway would perform with. So I think this is a very difficult question, and where a spillway is not provided, it's really important to think about the inflow design flood and not necessarily take it as the same as the spillway design, but maybe you have to think of different situations that could end up with a worse situation in terms of multiple extreme storms. The emergency response capability of getting water out of the dam if there was an extreme storm event, and the availability to actually do any work during these sorts of events that we really haven't experienced ourselves. So it's hard to understand how difficult it might be to get people to site to operate pumps to get water out and things like this. So to me, the bottom line is we have to prevent overtopping and really seriously think about how to do that. Okay, next slide. Next thing is this environmental design flood. The intention of this is it's the flood to be managed without release of untreated water to the environment. And this is to allow for this environmental design flood, we have to allow a storage capacity above the normal maximum operating level of our dam. And things that we need to consider in that are the water quality that could be released, regulatory requirements, the frequency of overflow events, the rate and duration of outflows, the environmental sensitivity of the receiving environment, the downstream flow in the receiving environment, and the mixing characteristics, but also public perception. So it's quite a complicated and many variables to consider when we're thinking about this, because once again, adding more water to the dam is likely to actually increase the risk of something going wrong with it. Okay, next please. So selecting the EDF, I've discussed some of these things. There's typically, it would be something that would be imposed from the regulating agencies as to what it might be. We need to then look at the environmental situation and particularly the mixing zones and dilution that might occur during flood flows. So by the time you have a very large flood, maybe the environmental impact is not as bad as it would be if there was release in a dry situation. So in Australia, for example, we do have some cases where we are allowed to release water during flood events, but not during normal dry conditions where the stream flows are very small. But typically the environmental design flood might be with a return period or an AEP of 1 in 10 or 1 in 200, something like that. And the difficult thing then is to decide how long what sort of a duration of event you should consider, but it's likely to be weeks or months depending on the importance of the receiving water. Icold in Australia do have an environmental spill consequence category method, which is where you use a similar consequence category to the dam failure that we've been talking about earlier today. And we were going to give some advice on that in the Icold bulletin. Next slide. Maximum operating level was another water level to consider. If you're going to have water safely stored in the dam, we really have to make sure that the dam is designed to store water. So a lot of upstream constructed dams really are not suitable for storing of water against the perimeter. And when you think about doing upstream construction on top of tailings, it's pretty obvious there's going to be consolidation and settling. And there's been numerous cases that I've seen where you end up with cracking of the upstream lifts, not only longitudinal cracking, but also transverse cracking across the dam walls. And upstream construction, there's no filters. It's very difficult or impossible to design an upstream construction with filters. So they're really, for various reasons, not suitable for storing water. So it's pretty important that if we are going to store water, well, that might mean you have to think seriously about what type of dam you're going to use. And importantly, if you do set a maximum operating level, well, that's what it should be. It should be the maximum operating level. And if you get to that, well, then you should have a TARP that would allow you to probably stop the whole mining operation or the process plant operation until you can get that operating level under control. Next slide, please, Harvey. Water balance is a very critical thing in hydrotechnical design. And what we mean by that is the ongoing balance of water across the facility, losses and inflows. So what we've got is transport water, which is probably the biggest component. Stream management, often there needs to be diversion of clean water from the surrounding catchment areas. Precipitation, so rainfall and the runoff that you'd normally calculate by normal hydrological methods. Decamp water, so we're normally taking water back off the dam to use in the process. Evaporation and seepage. So there's a lot of components. Some of them are very difficult to estimate, such as seepage and evaporation. Evaporation is potentially quite different to evaporation from water ponds because we might have a high salinity that affects the evaporation. But it's very important that we do get the water balance correct. And once you've set up a water balance, you need to really be monitoring it over time to make sure that you've got it right, because where we come unstuck, some of these dam failures occur because the water balance hasn't been under control, and so water is building up. Next slide, please, Harvey. So take-home messages on this aspect to me are be conservative with water management. So really make sure you understand how much water you've got. Try and minimise the water storage on dams. There's obviously going to be a balance between environmental requirements and how much water you store, but from the dam safety point of view, the less water we have, the better. I mean, I think spillways should be provided. It's not always the case, but if we don't provide spillways, we've got to be very careful in assessing how much storage capacity we need to provide to make sure there's no risk of water overtopping the dam. And upstream construction is not suitable for water storage, except in particular way where you might be able to store limited amounts of water within the tailings beach, but not allowing water to get anywhere near the external embankments. So that's all from me there, Harvey. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks very much, David. And I guess in the interest of time, we'll skip the question period. Maybe I'll quickly go into our last presentation. Just bear with me a moment. I'm sharing my screen. So this last talk, it's a short one, so bear with me a little bit. And it really was to highlight some of the training and education programs that are being developed in response to the realization in the industry that, first of all, the capacity of the whole range from engineers to operators to managers with tailing facilities is lacking, and also that we have thousands of tailing dams around the world, and it's really important that the people running these operations are trained, are aware of all the dam safety aspects of tailing dams. And so this, I just have a few slides here to share with you just to communicate some of the programs that are being carried out. And as I mentioned, the value of training is the cornerstone of building future designers, operators, and managers of tailing facilities. So we have quite a few of them, and I'll list a few of them, developed in collaboration with universities, which generally focus on the technical aspects and with courses that can be accredited with the university. There's some organizational bodies such as the Australia Institute of Mining and Metals and Australia Vocational Education Training Program that have developed training programs aimed at a range of tailings personnel. And now some of the major mining companies such as Glencore and BHP and Rio Tinto are stepping up with respect to training. So some of the university-led programs in the States is Colorado State University with Georgia Tech and Berkeley, and University of Illinois with tailing short courses. And same with University of Arizona with Colorado State and the Colorado School of Mines. Now, the University of Edmonton is a good center of geotechnical excellence, international short course on design and assessment of mine waste structures. And as Andy mentioned, this international landform design short course. At the University of British Columbia, and I didn't put the name there, but I have a slide on it, but they have a program in mine waste management. And in Australia, both University of Western Australia and University of Queensland are developing training programs, tailing management seminars, and courses. And many more other universities that I just can't mention them all, but certainly the universities are waking up that tailings is a legitimate career path, and they have to provide training in the universities so that people can design, operate, and manage closed tailings safely. So the one at the University of British Columbia, it's an online program with 2 weeks on campus. It's a flexible 2-year program, and it covers all the aspects of both tailings and waste rock. Basically, it's all focused on mine waste management. And this is one that David's been involved heavily with GHD and with the Australia Vocational Education Training Program. And basically, it's a 2-day course on site with all the operators from electricians to managers. And they run through all the different things of dam safety and surveillance, and it's both full day of classes, and then it's out on the tailings dam, just learning more about how the tailing dam works and what are the important components. And they have a written assessment exercise with that. Just recently, BHP and Rio Tinto teamed up with University of Western Australia for ongoing education programs called Future Tails. And primarily it's being directed by Professor Andy Fourie at the University of Western Australia. But they have a very ambitious agenda or different types of programs that they are developing. These haven't, to my knowledge, all been rolled out yet, but this is the vision. So it covers everything from tailing management for senior leaders to design and technology and operations. The other one, Australia Institute of Mining and Metals, has the Tailings Management course. It's a 1 to 6 week course online with 6 modules. And they cover introduction to tailings management, geotechnical considerations, geochemical and water considerations, governance and surveillance, closure, and socioeconomics. So that's another example of an online course that is available for people to take to start to learn more about tailings facilities. And the last one I'll describe, and this is one that I've been heavily involved with for the last few years. Glencore, which is the largest mining company in the world, is developing what's called a Tailings Manager Academy. It's a university-style model, theory, expert moments, case histories, case studies, interactive exams, and it's all online. And it's probably somewhere between 10 and 20 hours, depending on what level you're at. But I won't go through all these, but it covers all the things from principles, tailing dams, properties, governance, site characterization, pretty well all the elements that you see in the Icold Tailings Dam Safety Guideline that we're producing. And lastly, we went into the stakeholder engagement and public disclosure. So this course, 12 modules. There's 3 levels, one for operators, one for managers, and primarily the whole course is focused on the responsible tailings facility engineer. So that's your responsible engineer at the tailings facility, who has to know enough to be able to talk to consultants, know enough to be able to talk to regulators, and understand what's going on with their tailings facility. And so it has quite a high level of technical content. And I won't go through them all, but we have subject matter experts from around the world, several from Australia, 3 from the States, and some from Canada, UK. And these are all international specialists in their individual fields that do peer review of the modules and provide expert moments within the different course. So at the level now, I think it's rolled out. 5 of the modules have been rolled out, and the rest will be rolled out for the rest by the end of the year. And it's being translated into French, Spanish, and Russian. So I guess in summary, training is essential for safe design and management of tailing facilities. And with with thousands of tailing dams worldwide, there is a shortage of trained professionals. So everybody here today, you certainly have a career path, and many universities are taking up the challenge, and industry bodies are also stepping up and realizing that the mining industry needs trained personnel to survive. So I guess in closing, certainly Icold encourage everyone to always keep learning. Tailing facilities are fascinating, complex projects that involve a wide range of disciplines, and all are important. And I think that's a good closing note, even for our workshop today. And I see we're out of time, so I think I'll just make a brief summary of the workshop today before we close. The focus of our bulletin was to provide the tools you need to design and manage your facility safely. And so in the course today, you've learned about the importance of governance, the importance of the engineer of record, and the role that he plays in the safety of the dam. You learned about understanding the credible failure modes and determining what are the consequences of failure. How can your dam fail, and what are the consequences? And on the technical side, the design for closure, I think, even though it got slated a bit later, and David mentioned it should have been first, it's a critical part. And really it provides a vision of what we can do with tailing dams. They don't have to be hazardous, nasty structures. They can be responsible landforms that are sustainable, and that should be our focus in the design of them. At the same time, tailings are very different than water dams. Tailings are typically saturated, contractive, and understanding the geotechnical mechanisms and the potential for liquefaction is critical, as you saw from different failures. So understanding your stability analysis and the tailings behavior is paramount. And like Dave, ending on the water management, I always joke that if we didn't have water, I would be out of a job. Water controls everything, whether it's in the pore water, the pores of the tailings, or whether it's overtopping a dam. The management of water is one of our biggest and critical challenges to do safely. So I think I'll ask my colleagues on the line if they have a few closing quick words or not. But I think for the formal part of the program, that completes the symposium. And I do want to thank everybody, and especially all the hard work that went in by the presenters.
Yeah, I think your summary is very good, Harvey. I have nothing more to add.
Okay.
Yes, I agree, Harvey. I think that was a very good wrap up, and I agree wholeheartedly with what you've said, and hope the message has got through to some people today.
Well, thanks very much, everyone, and thank you to the co-host. So we will look forward to seeing you in Marseille later this year, COVID willing.
Thanks,
Okay,
Harvey.
bye all.
Thanks very much.
Bye.